Oh, this one should get some comments down below. But I truly believe what the title says, your horsepower doesn't matter near as much as people think. And it comes with some disclaimers in all fairness. Just got done putting a wash on my bike, and as I was looking at some of the parts on it and looking at my engine, I started to realize, you know, this is something I should make a video on, because I truly believe way too much emphasis gets put on horsepower, and I just don't think it's as important or matters near as much as everybody seems to think. Let's go through some of the reasons I say that. But before we do, let me give you a couple disclaimers. Now, if you're drag racing, it becomes much more important. Or, you know, if you're at the Bonneville Salt Flats and you're going for land speed records, it becomes much more important. But for riding out on the road every day, traveling, doing what we do on these motorcycles typically, it's just not that important. Everybody's talking about 131 engines and all these big things, but the reality is I just don't believe that's the answer, and I don't think that's what makes the most fun motorcycle. Now, having horsepower is certainly part of the equation, but it's not the factor that matters the most. And I truly believe this. I think there's a lot of other factors that come into play when making a good quality motorcycle, one that's fun to ride and you can enjoy on the road. So let's start with horsepower as it stands. The real job of horsepower, or the real place horsepower shows, is top speed. So the more horsepower you got, the higher top speed you can get, and weight really doesn't play that much of an issue when it comes to actual top speed, because it just might take you a little longer to get there. Horsepower is the factor for top speed, but how many hours on your rides are you spending over 120, 130, 140, 160 miles an hour? I'm guessing not too many. But let's say you like to ride really fast. That's okay, I understand. I definitely get it. But that horsepower number everybody's talking about is peak horsepower, okay? My bike's got 120, my bike's got 130 horse. Sure, maybe it hit 130 on some dyno, but let's be honest, your dyno number really does not matter at all. Like this much. They're not accurate or consistent, but that's for another video, and I promise to follow it up with a video on that. The reality is all these guys put all this time into achieving these high dyno numbers, and they're not consistent or accurate. There's so many variables in play, and it's your peak. What's way more important is your curve. Okay, you're not using that peak horsepower all the time. It's not like every time you touch that throttle, you're getting that horsepower number. We're all bragging on it. It becomes very much egotistical or a bragging factor. And I'm not gonna say I've never spoke about how many horsepower my bike has either, but the reality is on the road, that doesn't matter. There's a blip in the window of that motorcycle where you actually ever see that peak horsepower number. The rest of your ride, you're riding in the usable curve, and things like torque and other things tend to matter a little bit more, in my opinion. And horsepower comes with some inherent problems, typically weight. As you start to make more horsepower, you end up going into bigger engines, bigger parts, and those parts weigh more. Weight might be even more important than horsepower, because that is what allows you to do well. Also, how do you get that horsepower to the ground? What's your drivetrain look like? What do your tires look like? How's your bike set up? Your suspension, okay? There's a reason that a 700 horsepower, near 700 horsepower Shelby GT500 can be outran by a Tesla that has 400 or 500 horsepower. Well, it's four-wheel drive. It puts the power to the ground. It can use it. And in a quarter mile, that 400 or 500 horsepower Tesla can outrun that 700 horsepower Shelby GT500. It's not just horsepower. Your horsepower is not what matters. I see all these guys buying new bikes and just going out and doing everything they can to make monster horsepower. But the reality is, you can spend all that money putting big horsepower in your bike, but where are you using it? I guarantee you it's not in the curves unless you've put some time and thought into suspension. Me, I use Legend suspension in the rear, the Revo Arcs. I can adjust all my dampening and rebound, everything right on the shock as I go. It's a remote reservoir. The suspension to me makes every bit a difference as horsepower, maybe even more, because you can do all these high speed rides, but in the end, if you're getting wobbles and your bike doesn't set up right and you can't set it into corners, where are you using it? I have ridden this motorcycle alongside bikes with more horsepower and outran them. because my bike sets better in the corners. A lot of that has to do with having proper suspension, not investing all your money in horsepower. It just doesn't matter the most. And typically I love to run the Legend axles in the front as well. This year I put a Kraus system in there, and not only did it improve the suspension up front, but it also reduced weight. Weight's gonna be your next big factor, right? Like I've done things like a billet aluminum swing arm from Trask Performance, carbon fiber. I've done a lot of things to this bike to reduce the weight, which at the end of the day on the street really makes a bigger difference than horsepower. Another thing to think about is aerodynamics. Your aerodynamics are a major factor. If you've got a nicely designed fairing and a windshield like this Clockworks that's putting downward pressure, okay, this is gonna help you in your handling out there on the road and in the corners. We're not always just going down a straight drag strip. Or what if you're behind just a headlight? You've got no fairing at all. Okay, that major horsepower, those really high-end speeds, you're gonna be catching the wind all different, and it's gonna completely change the performance of your motorcycle. There's just so many factors besides horsepower, and I see all these guys getting so hung up on how many horsepower their bike's putting out. I just genuinely believe that there needs to be an even balance when building a motorcycle. You cannot put all your budget in having the biggest horsepower so you can go stand in the parking lot and tell everybody your bike's got the most horsepower. Or maybe you can outrun them for a split second going down the interstate. Because at the end of the day, when you get into the twisties and when you get into the real riding, that horsepower is not going to win for you. You've got to invest a portion of your budget into suspension. You've got to invest a portion of your budget into weight reduction. And you need to be thinking about torque. Again, it's that curve, it's that usable power range, that range from 0 to 60, 40 to 80. Those are the ranges you want to have the most power. And chances are when you're running those speeds, very rarely are you in or using that max horsepower number. If you're just building your bike for a max horsepower number, you are not gonna have a bike that performs as well as a bike who's built properly, focusing on all of the factors. And it's just gonna be less fun to ride. Now, by no means am I suggesting you don't invest in increasing your power. I'm just saying don't get hyper focused on it. Me, I like to take an existing engine about the factory setup for the pistons and the displacement, and I like to add like a Thunder Max tuner. I like to add like a nice cam. I like to add a D&D exhaust, a high flow intake. These are the things that are going to give you more horsepower and more torque, but with a good recipe, an equal balance, and make your bike reliable too. I recently took this on a 1 month, 10,000 mile ride. Zero issues. You can build an engine to the hilt and you can bore it out as big as you want to go, but at the end of the day, you start to lose reliability in those situations too, and that makes the bike a whole lot less enjoyable to ride when you're always broken down. In the end, people chase horsepower because it's told to us by so many people it's so important. It's what matters. What matters is having fun on a motorcycle. And while horsepower is one of the equation, it is certainly not the equation. Things like acceleration, handling, braking, suspension, grip, what tires you're running. These are the things that make a motorcycle fun. And then none of those fun things matter if you're not running proper ergonomics. And that means a proper seating, foot, and handlebar position. Because you can have the fastest performing motorcycle in the world, but if it hurts to ride it or you get uncomfortable quickly, it just doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter how many horsepower you got if you don't enjoy riding the bike. Me, I do the Sandoval Kraus risers with the fully adjustable bars. They move in and out, up and down. I can tweak these bars to set up exactly how I want them. And they're designed to give you a full view of the new screen or the old style dash as well. They move the dampening from the triple tree into the handlebar right here. So now you're not getting that flex on that long leverage point. Another thing that stops you from using your max horsepower, especially in the corner, is when you got big long apes and you're pushing on them and they got their steel and they're heavy and they got that flex, and you push on the bars flexing, and then you got a big soft bushing and that's flexing, and that's gonna give you poor handling in the corners. I don't care how much horsepower you got, if you got all kinds of flex in your bars when you're going around a corner, you ain't using that horsepower there, I promise. How about your floorboards? Are they too low? Are they too forward? Are they too down? Are they as dragging or scraping point? Or do they allow you to lean the bike over further? That's gonna make a difference on how hard you can corner that motorcycle. Again, don't matter how much horsepower you got if you're scraping as soon as you enter those corners. These boards that I'm using here are the Kraus Max Lean boards, and they actually give you a further lean angle than what you get from the factory. And this is just what I set this bike up to do some long distance touring, but to have the performance, to have a ton of fun in the mountains. There's lots of options out there, you guys can check them all out, but I strongly suggest getting into a T-bar setup of handlebars. I definitely prefer to use the Sandoval Kraus line. I think it's the most adjustable and the best performing bar out there. We're the only one that's moved these bushings up here like this and can tweak it to your height and shoulder preferences. I'm a huge fan of my Legend suspensions. I've run them on all my bikes. I think that's a great thing to put. And my Trask, D&D, all the parts I've mentioned I put on this bike, I stand behind. I've put thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of miles on some of these parts, and they have performed well for me and let me get the most out of my motorcycle. I'll link all these parts in the description below if you want to check them out, get a direct link, or do your own research and find what works best for you. Don't write off horsepower. It's not saying it doesn't mean anything. Kind of like my Shelby Tesla analogy earlier, it's just not what matters. It's not the factor. If you got all that horsepower but you can't keep it underground, or you can't have a steady bike doing it, or all your other functions of that bike are not in tune, that horsepower means squat, and you ain't outrunning anybody. Unless you happen to be going in a straight line down to Bonneville Salt Flats, and then even your suspension and some other things still play a huge factor into keeping your bike stable. I don't know. Let's hear all the comments down below. You guys can tell me how I'm wrong. I'm no mechanic, but I dang sure like to ride it, and I've put down a ton of miles, and I can tell you what works on the road. It ain't just about horsepower. I stand by my statement. Let me have it down below. I look forward to reading your comments.